The spotlight was warm, almost comforting, as it bathed the stage in golden light. 5,000 people filled Bally's casino in Las Vegas, their faces eager, their applause thunderous. It was March 21st, 1987, and Dean Martin, the king of cool himself, stood center stage, microphone in hand, ready to deliver what he'd done 1,000 times before. His voice, smooth as aged whiskey, began to weave through the opening notes of "Everybody Loves Somebody." The crowd swayed, enchanted by the man who had spent decades making love songs sound effortless, making loneliness sound romantic, making pain look like pleasure. But then something happened. Mid-verse, Dean Martin stopped singing. His face, usually so composed, so unshakable, went pale. His eyes, those twinkling brown eyes that had charmed millions, suddenly looked empty, distant, as if staring into an abyss no one else could see. The music continued, but the voice that had crooned a generation to sleep fell silent. In that moment, on that stage, surrounded by thousands of adoring fans, Dean Martin learned that his son was dead. And what happened next would break him forever. To understand the magnitude of that moment, we need to go back. Back to when Dino Paul Crocetti was just a kid from Steubenville, Ohio, the son of Italian immigrants who barely spoke English. Dean Martin wasn't born into glamour or elegance. He was born into struggle. His father was a barber, his mother worked odd jobs, and young Dino grew up in a world where the American dream was something you heard about but rarely saw. He dropped out of school in the 10th grade, not because he was lazy but because survival demanded it. He worked in a steel mill, delivered bootleg liquor during Prohibition, and even stepped into the boxing ring as a welterweight, where he took punches for prize money under the name Kid Crochet. Life was hard, life was raw, and somewhere in those early years, Dean learned to mask pain with a smile, to hide vulnerability behind a wall of charm. But Dean had a gift. A voice that could turn a smoky nightclub into a cathedral, a voice that could make loneliness feel like company. He started singing in local clubs, and by the time he was in his 20s, he'd changed his name to Dean Martin and set his sights on something bigger. He wanted out of Steubenville. He wanted the lights, the applause, the kind of life where you didn't have to fight for every meal. In 1946, Dean's life changed forever when he met a hyperactive young comedian named Jerry Lewis at the Glass Hat Club in New York. They hit it off immediately, and what started as a casual partnership turned into one of the most legendary comedy duos in entertainment history. Martin and Lewis became a phenomenon. Dean was the smooth, laid-back crooner. Jerry was the manic, rubber-faced clown, and together they were unstoppable. They sold out nightclubs, dominated radio, conquered television, and made 17 films together. For 10 years, they were the biggest act in America. But behind the laughter, there was tension. Dean felt overshadowed, reduced to the straight man while Jerry got all the laughs. He resented it, quietly at first, then more openly. By 1956, the partnership had soured, and they went their separate ways. Many predicted Dean's career was over, that without Jerry Lewis, he was nothing. They were wrong. Dean Martin proved he didn't need anyone. He launched a solo career that eclipsed everything he'd done before. He became a recording artist with hits like That's Amore, Volare, and Everybody Loves Somebody, which knocked the Beatles off the top of the charts. He became a movie star, appearing in films alongside Frank Sinatra, John Wayne, and Marlon Brando. He joined the Rat Pack, that legendary group of entertainers that defined cool in the 1960s, alongside Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, and Joey Bishop. They owned Las Vegas. They partied with presidents. They lived like kings. And then there was the Dean Martin Show, a variety program that ran from 1965 to 1974 and became one of the most watched shows on television. Dean made it all look easy. He'd stroll onto the stage, a drink in one hand, a cigarette in the other, cracking jokes, singing songs, making audiences feel like they were at a private party with an old friend. He cultivated an image of effortless charm, the guy who never rehearsed, never worried, never broke a sweat. The drunk uncle everyone loved. But it was all an act. Dean Martin was a professional. He rehearsed meticulously. He was disciplined, focused, and far more complex than the character he played on television. Behind the cool exterior was a man who valued privacy, who guarded his emotions, who rarely let anyone see the real him. Dean Martin was married 3 times and had 8 children. His first marriage was to Elizabeth and MacDonald, with whom he had 4 children, Craig, Claudia, Gail, and Deanna. That marriage fell apart, as so many Hollywood marriages do, strained by the demands of fame and the pressures of life in the spotlight. Dean's second marriage was to Jean Beager, a stunning former Orange Bowl queen. They married in 1949, and together they had 3 children: Dean Paul, Richie, and Gina. This marriage lasted 24 years, the longest and most stable of Dean's life. But even that union couldn't survive the weight of celebrity, and they divorced in 1973. Dean's third marriage, to Catherine Hahn, lasted only 3 years and produced 1 daughter, Sasha. By the time the 1980s rolled around, Dean Martin had lived a full life. He'd achieved everything a man could dream of. He was rich, famous, beloved. But all the success in the world couldn't prepare him for what was coming. Dean Paul Martin, known affectionately as Dino Jr., was Dean's golden boy. Born on November 17, 1951, he was the eldest son from Dean's second marriage, and from the very beginning, he was special. Handsome, charismatic, talented, Dean Paul seemed destined to follow in his father's footsteps. And in many ways, he did. In the 1960s, he formed a pop band called Dino, Desi and Billy with Desi Arnaz Jr., the son of Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz, and their friend Billy Hinch. The group had a few hits, toured the country, and enjoyed a taste of fame. But Dean Paul didn't want to be just another celebrity kid riding his father's coattails. He wanted to carve out his own identity, to prove he was more than just Dean Martin's son. So he pursued acting, landing roles in television shows and films, though none of them made him a star. He was a phenomenal athlete, excelling in tennis to the point where he competed in professional tournaments. He was also a licensed pilot with a deep love for aviation, and in 1980, he joined the California Air National Guard, where he trained to fly F-4 Phantom jets. This was Dean Paul's true passion. Flying. The freedom of the skies, the adrenaline of piloting a fighter jet, the discipline and precision required to master such a machine. His father was proud, though quietly worried. Dean Martin knew the risks of military aviation, knew that every time his son climbed into that cockpit, there was a chance he might not come back. But Dean Paul loved it, and Dean, despite his fears, supported his son's dreams. Dean Paul was married twice. His first marriage was to actress Olivia Hussey, famous for her role as Juliet in Franco Zeffirelli's Romeo and Juliet. They had a son, Alexander, but the marriage didn't last. His second marriage was to Olympic figure skater Dorothy Hamill, America's sweetheart and a gold medalist. That marriage, too, ended in divorce. Despite the personal turbulence, Dean Paul remained close to his family, especially his father. There was a bond between them, something unspoken but deeply felt. Dean Martin wasn't an emotionally expressive man. He didn't say, "I love you" often, didn't wear his heart on his sleeve. But those who knew him understood that his love ran deep, especially when it came to his children. And Dean Paul, the golden boy, the son who could do anything, was perhaps the closest to his father's heart. March 21, 1987, started like any other day for Dean Paul Martin. He arrived at March Air Force Base in Riverside County, California, for what was supposed to be a routine training mission. It was a cold, overcast morning, the kind of weather that makes pilots cautious but not alarmed. Dean Paul, now a captain in the California Air National Guard, climbed into the cockpit of his F-4C Phantom jet alongside his weapons systems officer, Captain Ramon Ortiz. They were part of a 3-plane formation conducting maneuvers in the San Bernardino Mountains. The mission was standard, nothing they hadn't done dozens of times before. But the weather was deteriorating. Clouds thickened, visibility dropped, and a snowstorm was rolling into the area. Still, the mission proceeded. At some point during the flight, Dean Paul's jet vanished from radar. No distress call. No mayday. One moment it was there, the next it was gone. The other pilots in the formation tried to make contact, but there was only silence. Back at the base, alarms went off. Search and rescue teams were dispatched immediately. Helicopters scoured the rugged mountain terrain, but the weather made it nearly impossible to see anything. Hours passed, then days. The search continued, but hope was fading. On March 26, 5 days after the crash, searchers finally found the wreckage. The F-4 Phantom had slammed into the side of Mount San Gorgonio, the highest peak in Southern California, at an altitude of over 11,000 feet. The impact was catastrophic. The jet had disintegrated on impact, scattering debris across the snow-covered mountainside. Captain Dean Paul Martin and Captain Ramon Ortiz were found dead. They had perished instantly. But rewind to March 21st, the day of the crash. Dean Martin was in Las Vegas, preparing for a performance at Bally's casino. He had no idea what had happened. He didn't know his son's plane was missing. He didn't know search teams were combing the mountains. He was focused on the show, on giving the audience what they came for. The lights dimmed, the announcer's voice boomed through the speakers, and Dean walked onto the stage to a standing ovation. 5,000 people were on their feet, clapping, cheering, welcoming the King of Cool. Dean smiled, waved, took his place at the microphone, and the band began to play. Everybody Loves Somebody filled the room, and Dean's voice, that unmistakable voice, began to sing. But then, mid-performance, someone from his management team appeared backstage, frantic, ashen-faced. They tried to get Dean's attention discreetly, but the urgency was impossible to hide. Dean noticed. He saw the panic in their eyes. He stopped singing. The music faltered, then stopped. The audience, confused, watched as Dean stepped back from the microphone. Someone whispered in his ear. And in that instant, Dean Martin's world shattered. His son's plane was missing. Presumed crashed. The details were unclear, but the implication was obvious. Dean Paul was gone. Dean didn't scream. He didn't collapse. He didn't show the audience what was happening inside him. Instead, he did what he'd done his entire life. He composed himself. He walked off the stage calmly, quietly, as if nothing was wrong. The audience didn't understand what had happened. Some thought he was sick. Others thought it was part of the show. But those who knew Dean, those backstage, saw the truth. They saw the light go out in his eyes. They saw a man who had just been hollowed out, stripped of everything that mattered. Dean left Las Vegas immediately. He flew back to California, where the search for his son was still underway. 4 or 5 agonizing days, Dean waited. He didn't sleep. He didn't eat. He clung to a shred of hope, a desperate, irrational belief that maybe, somehow, his son had survived. Maybe he'd ejected. Maybe he was out there, injured but alive, waiting to be found. But deep down, Dean knew. He'd known the moment he walked off that stage. And when they finally found the wreckage, when they confirmed that Dean Paul and Captain Ortiz had died on impact, whatever fragile hope Dean had been holding on to disintegrated. The funeral was a quiet, private affair. Dean Martin, the man who had entertained millions, who had lived his life in the public eye, wanted no cameras, no reporters, no spectacle. Just family. Just grief. Dean stood at his son's graveside, expressionless, hollow. Friends said he looked like a ghost, like a man who was physically present but spiritually absent. He didn't cry, at least not in front of anyone. He just stood there, staring at the casket, unable to comprehend that his golden boy, his brilliant, talented, beloved son, was gone forever. In the weeks and months that followed, Dean Martin became a shadow of himself. Friends noticed the change immediately. Jerry Lewis, despite their complicated history, reached out to offer condolences. He later said, "Dean was never the same after Dino died. That light behind his eyes, it dimmed. He never smiled the same way again." Frank Sinatra, Dean's closest friend, tried to pull him out of his depression, tried to get him back on stage, back into life. But Dean didn't want it. He didn't want the lights, the applause, the adoration. None of it mattered anymore. Dean retreated into isolation. He stopped performing regularly. He turned down offers, canceled appearances, withdrew from public life. He spent most of his time alone in his Beverly Hills mansion, drinking, smoking, staring at nothing. He watched old westerns on television, played golf occasionally, but mostly he just existed. The man who had once been the life of every party now wanted nothing to do with parties. The man who had made millions laugh now found nothing funny. The world had lost its color, its music, its meaning. In 1988, Frank Sinatra convinced Dean to join him on a reunion tour called Together Again, which also included Sammy Davis Jr. It was supposed to be a triumphant comeback, a celebration of the Rat Pack's legacy. But Dean's heart wasn't in it. He looked tired, disengaged, almost frail. After just a few shows, Dean walked off the tour, citing exhaustion and kidney problems. But everyone knew the real reason. He was broken. He couldn't pretend anymore. He couldn't put on the mask and play the role of the carefree crooner. That version of Dean Martin had died with his son. Dean's health began to decline. He'd been a heavy smoker for decades, and by the early 1990s, he was suffering from emphysema and other respiratory issues. His doctors urged him to get treatment, possibly surgery, but Dean refused. He didn't want to fight. He didn't want to prolong a life that had lost its joy. He spent his final years in near-total seclusion, rarely leaving his home, rarely seeing anyone outside of immediate family. His daughter Deanna later described visiting him during this period, saying he was kind and loving but distant, as if part of him was already gone. On Christmas morning, 1995, Dean Martin's housekeeper found him unresponsive in his bed. He had died of acute respiratory failure, his lungs finally giving out after decades of cigarettes and a refusal to seek medical intervention. He was 78 years old. His death was quiet, unremarkable, the opposite of the vibrant, larger-than-life persona he'd projected for so many years. There was no grand farewell, no final performance, no dramatic exit. Just a man alone, slipping away in his sleep on Christmas Day. Dean Martin's funeral was held at the Pierce Brothers Westwood Village Memorial Park Cemetery in Los Angeles. Unlike the private service for his son, this one was attended by hundreds of mourners, including celebrities, family, and fans. Frank Sinatra, despite being in poor health himself, was there. So was Shirley MacLaine, Bob Newhart, and countless others whose lives Dean had touched. But even in death, Dean maintained his privacy. He was buried next to his son, Dean Paul. Father and son, reunited at last. The headstone is simple, understated, much like the man himself. No grand declarations, no lengthy epitaphs. Just his name, his dates, and the quiet acknowledgement of a life lived. But the story doesn't end there. Because Dean Martin's legacy is far more complicated than the image he projected. To the world, he was the king of cool, the guy with the drink in his hand and the twinkle in his eye. But to those who knew him, he was a deeply private, emotionally complex man who used humor and charm as shields. He was a devoted father who loved his children fiercely, but struggled to express it. He was a perfectionist who rehearsed tirelessly, but made everything look effortless. He was a man who carried pain quietly, who buried his emotions deep, and who ultimately never recovered from the loss of his son. Dean Martin's story is a reminder that fame and fortune don't protect you from grief. That no amount of success can shield you from the pain of losing someone you love. That beneath the surface of even the most seemingly carefree lives, there is often profound sadness. Dean spent his entire career making people feel good, making them forget their troubles, making them believe that life was easy and fun. But the truth is, life wasn't easy for Dean Martin. And when he lost his son, the facade finally cracked, and the world saw the man behind the smile. A man who was broken. A man who never truly healed. Dean Paul Martin's death wasn't just a personal tragedy for his father. It was a symbol of something larger. The loss of innocence, the shattering of the myth that success and happiness go hand in hand. Dean Martin had everything. Money, fame, adoration. But none of it mattered when his son died. In that moment on stage at Bally's casino, when the music stopped and Dean's face went pale, something fundamental changed. The king of cool, the man who never seemed rattled, was exposed as human. Vulnerable. Fragile. And maybe that's the most important lesson of Dean Martin's life. That it's okay to be vulnerable. That it's okay to grieve, to break down, to admit that some losses are too much to bear. Dean spent his life hiding his pain, masking his emotions, playing a character that the world wanted to see. But in the end, the character couldn't save him. The persona couldn't protect him. He was just a father who lost his son, and nothing in the world could fix that. So when you think of Dean Martin, don't just remember the smooth voice and the effortless charm. Remember the man who stood on that stage in Las Vegas and stopped singing. Remember the father who spent his final years in mourning, unable to find joy in a world that had taken his golden boy. Remember the human being behind the legend, the one who loved deeply, hurt profoundly, and never quite figured out how to put the pieces back together. Because that's the real story of Dean Martin. Not the one of glamour and success, but the one of love and loss, of pain hidden behind a smile, of a man who gave the world everything he had and still ended up alone. It's a story that breaks your heart, not because it's dramatic or sensational, but because it's true. Because it's real. Because somewhere in Dean Martin's tragedy, we see a reflection of our own struggles, our own fears, our own capacity for love, and the devastating consequences when that love is ripped away. Dean Martin's life teaches us that we can't control the things that matter most. We can't protect the people we love from fate. We can't rehearse for heartbreak or prepare for loss. All we can do is live fully, love deeply, and accept that sometimes, despite our best efforts, life will break us. And when it does, we have a choice. We can retreat into isolation, as Dean did, or we can find a way to keep going, to honor the memory of those we've lost by continuing to live. Dean Martin chose isolation. He couldn't bear to perform, to pretend, to be the person the world expected him to be. And maybe that was the only choice he could make. Maybe the pain was too great, the loss too overwhelming. Or maybe in his final years, Dean finally stopped performing and started being himself. A grieving father. A man without answers. A soul searching for peace in a world that had taken everything that mattered. When Dean Martin died on Christmas Day 1995, the world mourned the loss of an icon. Tributes poured in from every corner of the entertainment industry. People remembered his music, his movies, his effortless style. But very few talked about the grief he carried, the sorrow that defined his final years. Very few acknowledged that the King of Cool had spent nearly a decade as a broken man, living in the shadow of a loss he could never overcome. Today, Dean Martin's music still plays on the radio. His films still air on television. His image still graces posters and advertisements, the eternal symbol of sophistication and charm. But if you listen closely to his songs, especially the later ones, you can hear something beneath the smooth surface. A sadness, a longing, a sense of something lost. Maybe it was always there, hidden in plain sight, or maybe it only became audible after Dean Paul's death. Either way, it's there. A reminder that even legends are human. That even icons can be broken. Dean Martin's story is one of the great American tragedies. Not because he failed, but because he succeeded beyond measure and still ended up empty. Not because he lacked love, but because he loved so deeply that losing his son destroyed him. Not because he lived poorly, but because he lived so fully that when life took away what mattered most, there was nothing left. And so we're left with this image. Dean Martin standing alone on a stage, microphone in hand, the music playing, the audience waiting, and in that single frozen moment, the realization dawning that his son is gone. The performance stops. The facade cracks. The King of Cool becomes just a man, just a father, just a human being experiencing the most profound pain imaginable. And nothing, not the fame, not the fortune, not the adoration of millions, can take that pain away. That's the moment that defined Dean Martin's legacy. Not the hits, not the Rat Pack, not the television show. But that moment of vulnerability, of raw, unfiltered humanity. The moment when the world saw that beneath the cool exterior was a heart that could break. And it did break. Completely. Irreparably. Forever. Dean Martin never recovered from the loss of his son. He lived for 8 more years, but in many ways, he died that day in March 1987. The rest was just epilogue. A slow fade. A quiet ending to a life that had been anything but quiet. And when he finally did pass away, on that Christmas morning in Beverly Hills, perhaps it was a mercy. A release from the pain that had haunted him for nearly a decade. A chance to be reunited with the son he had lost, the golden boy who had died too young, too suddenly, too senselessly. In the end, Dean Martin's story isn't about success or fame. It's about love. The love of a father for his son. The love that makes life worth living, and the loss that makes it unbearable. It's a story that reminds us to cherish the people we care about, to hold them close, to tell them we love them while we still can. Because life is fragile, unpredictable, and sometimes devastatingly cruel. And when tragedy strikes, all the success in the world won't matter. All that will matter is the love we gave and the love we lost. Dean Martin gave the world decades of joy. He made us laugh, made us cry, made us feel like anything was possible. But in his darkest hour, the world couldn't give back what it had taken from him. His son, his golden boy, his reason to keep smiling. And so Dean stopped smiling. He stopped performing. He stopped being the King of Cool. And he became what he'd always been beneath the surface, a man. A father. A soul in pain. That's the real Dean Martin. The one history often forgets. The one behind the legend. The one who stood on that stage in Las Vegas, heard the worst news of his life, and walked away from everything. Because when you lose the thing that matters most, nothing else matters at all. Not the applause. Not the fame. Not the legacy. Just the love. And the unbearable weight of its absence. Dean Martin's final years were a testament to the power of grief. It can consume you, define you, destroy you. It did all three to Dean. But perhaps in his seclusion, in his silence, in his refusal to pretend anymore, Dean found a kind of honesty he'd never allowed himself before. He stopped being the character the world wanted and started being the man he actually was. A grieving father. A broken soul. A human being trying to survive an unsurvivable loss. And maybe, just maybe, that's the most authentic Dean Martin ever was. Not the smooth crooner with the martini glass. Not the Rat Pack legend with the perfect quip. But the father standing at his son's grave, the man staring into the void, the soul grappling with a pain that had no remedy. That's the Dean Martin who matters. That's the one we should remember. Because he's the one who shows us that it's okay to not be okay. That it's okay to break. That it's okay to stop performing when life becomes too heavy to bear. Dean Martin's story ends the way so many stories do. Quietly. Sadly. With more questions than answers. But it also ends with a truth that resonates across generations. Love is the most powerful force in the world, and its loss is the most devastating. Dean Martin loved his son, and when he lost him, he lost himself. There's no shame in that. There's only humanity. Raw, painful, beautiful humanity. And so, as we remember Dean Martin, the voice, the style, the legend, let's also remember the father. The man who stood on that stage and stopped singing because his world had just ended. Let's honor not just his contributions to entertainment, but his capacity to love so deeply that its absence left him empty. Let's acknowledge that behind every legend is a person, flawed and fragile, capable of joy and devastation in equal measure. Dean Martin's life was extraordinary, but his pain was universal. And in that pain, we find connection. We find empathy. We find ourselves. Because we've all loved. We've all lost. We've all, at some point, been broken. And if a legend like Dean Martin couldn't escape that pain, then maybe none of us can. Maybe the best we can do is feel it, honor it, and keep going, even when it feels impossible. That's the legacy of Dean Martin. Not just the music, but the reminder that we're all human. That we all break. And that sometimes being broken is the most honest thing we can be.